This says the inception of the center 25 years ago. We just figured out it's almost 30 years ago, 1986. So Lance has been here for a long time. He got his PhD at UCSF in human development and aging, and has published a lot, has been involved with this kind of studies for a very long time, and we are looking forward to hearing what he has to say about sex.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you all for coming. As was stated in the advertisement for the talk, that the inspiration for the subject matter was this New York Times Sunday Review article that was actually, the link was posted to APORnet. APOR is the American Association of Public Opinion Research, and they maintain a bulletin board, a professional exchange where people can exchange ideas and articles and talk about all things public opinion research. And reading that article got my dander up, to say the least. And particularly when the person who posted it, his comment was, quote, "The article raises serious questions about the veracity of surveys on sex and quite possibly surveys generally," which is a big challenge. It's like, well, it's telling us that all these surveys on sexual behavior are completely empty and worthless. So it raised the question, why do we still resort to something so old school as actually asking people questions? For all in the era of internet studies and big data and everything else, why are we still doing this? So there are physiological measures of sexual behavior. They mostly deal with arousal. It's called plethysmography. Right now, the instrumentation is very invasive, so it's only used in experimental mode. Invasive in the sense that for women it's a vaginal probe, usually a light source that's in a vaginal probe, and it's looking at the change in the blood engorgement of the lining of the vagina when she gets aroused. For men, it's something that goes around the penis, again, assessing arousal. So not something you can use generally. Physiological measures are not going to be able to differentiate low-risk and high-risk sexual activities, or whether the partner was a primary partner or a casual partner or whatever. It doesn't tell you that much. Keep in mind that even if our instrumentation is updated to something wonderful, something you can do with your new iWatch, etc., it's still going to have the same limitations. It's only going to tell you that something happened. They might have enough measurement to tell you that it's something sexual that happened, but not much else. They've also found, some research has shown that the correlations between self-reports and these kind of physiological arousal studies don't correlate very well, and apparently that departures particularly shows up in women. Direct observation, well, for obvious reasons, for the most part, that isn't going to work. Mostly for reasons of cultural prescription. Note, I did not say IRB prescription, because we've already had, you can, for example, Bill got approval to do observations in bathhouses.
But not the sex.
Well, not specifically the sex, although, so what, you averted your eyes when everybody...
Well, we couldn't record what people did.
Right, but you could observe it.
But we could see.
Yes. Observation has the ability to differentiate low-risk and high-risk sexual activities, although not all the time. If you, in, for example, a bathhouse, you may not be able to exactly tell what's going on all the time, so it might not be 100%. But irrelevant, because we're not going to be able to do it anyway. Also, the active observation is likely to affect the behavior being observed. People know they're being observed, they're going to change what they do, or whether it's conscious or unconscious, they will change. I've also put a note here that we do use methods like diary keeping, or the more updated version is they have mobile apps. They do this for drug studies, et cetera, and they'll go in and say, each morning they get a reminder to report what they did last night. I can report that in, but of course, this is intrusive. You are reminding the person that they are in a study every day. So it affects the behavior that they might engage in. So mostly we've been using biological markers, which are biological markers of risky sexual behavior, HIV, STIs. These tend to be low incidence, which is problematic from a statistical standpoint. Costs can be prohibitive, although that's been coming down. But we also know that for any given individual, that the relationship between the risk behavior and these biological outcomes is imperfect. It varies a lot. It depends on that individual's exposure to the reservoir, in terms of HIV, reservoir of HIV disease as represented by their partners. It depends on the number of actual exposures. In developing countries, it also turns on their genital health and circumcision and a few other things. So we are left with asking questions, having people self-report their sexual behavior because that's the best we can do, basically. Now, the op-ed piece got my dander up because, and this is just obvious, a little excerpt from the beginning, is that he said people lie to friends, lovers, doctors, surveys, and themselves. He analyzed data from the GSS. He said, so who is telling the truth, men or women? He says neither. Lying, not telling the truth. Usually you do a presentation and you work way up to a recommendation. I'm going to start with a recommendation. Never use these words. Ever. Don't let your investigators use these words. Don't think these words. Because if you're not going to believe what people tell you in a survey, then never do a survey. Never read a survey. Never use their data. You have to believe what people tell you. And we go through all kinds of rigmarole, the methods that are used for survey research, so that we're trying to get the most honest answers we can. And the long history of survey research shows that the vast majority of respondents to surveys are trying to answer honestly as they can, given the questions they're asked, which are imperfect, given the response sets we offer to them, which are imperfect, given their recall, which is imperfect, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. I would also point out that if the respondent is intentionally misleading you, then it's very difficult for that person to give consistent answers across the length and breadth of a detailed sexual behavior assessment. Obviously, in a lot of these national surveys, the assessment can be very brief. But to try and keep that all straight when you've lied to start is very difficult. It's also, as I said, not the likeliest scenario that they are intentionally misleading you, because there are so many other sources of error when you do survey research, particularly in sex surveys. The questions are often not very good. We're going to talk about that. It's sometimes difficult to answer the questions truthfully. And, bottom line, sexual behavior can be very intricate and involved, and people's sex lives can be very intricate and involved. Shorthand term, messy. So that we ask these questions as though people do things very regularly in a very, ordered manner, things that you can count easily, and this is not the way life works. This is not unique to sexual behavior. It just tends to show up more in that because it's so private and because it can be so involving and intricate. So, Stephens-Davidowtz is not the first person to notice that the GSS data doesn't look right in terms of sexual behavior. This is from a paper by Tom Smith, who is the PI of the General Social Survey. And this is one of the tables from one of his papers, and what you're seeing here is the number of lifetime sex partners from the 1989 GSS. And you can see that the differences in the mean number of partners between men and women is really big. And it doesn't pretty much matter how much he adjusts that data to try and take that difference out. You're seeing ratios of basically 3 or 4 to 1, and those differences are very significant. The same thing, not quite as big a difference, but this is number of frequency of sexual intercourse. Again, the males higher than the females. Part of what he's concluding here is that, well, the expectation is that in a closed population, there should not be any gender differences in amount or frequency of sex, that the men and the women should they're complementary, and so they're having sex with each other. So in terms of heterosexual sex, they should be balancing. That the gender differences are, what he found is mostly concentrated among unmarried people, and that he concluded that the results were primarily from intentional over-reporting by males and intentional under-reporting by females, and that he assumed this because it was consistent with gender differences they found in social values about sexuality. That, in other words, in the late 80s, we were still getting the stereotyped responses to their social value questions that men should be active and out there and virile, and women should be prim and proper and not so sexually active. I'm thinking in the 21st century that may not be necessarily true anymore, and it certainly isn't necessarily true in sexual minority subgroups. So there was a more interestingly, Morris did I'm sure article, actually a letter to Nature, also looking at the GSS data that was a little bit more comprehensive. And what she did is she went through and looked at what each of the possible explanations might be, and if that was the only explanation, how much that would have to happen in order to address the differences between there being in the reports between men and women. And so one of the things is that men tend to be older than their female partners, at least among heterosexuals in the United States. But greater than 60% of lifetime partners would have to be less than 18 years old for that age difference to go away. We talked about the assumption of a closed population. For men, it's not really closed because there's a whole commercial sex work network that serves men. It doesn't matter whether the workers are men or women, they're serving men for the most part. But they would have to report, on average, a large number of commercial sex worker contacts in order to explain the difference, if this were the sole reason. Sex travel is another, or maybe not sex travel specifically, but having sex while you're traveling and therefore out of the country and therefore out of your population might account for it. But again, it's the issue of the magnitude of what would have to be going on in order to explain the difference. And then finally, is there some kind of, is it an over-reporting, under-reporting bias? Is it solely that? And her analysis was, well, men would have to be over-reporting on an average 65% and women simultaneously under-reporting by 200% in order for you to achieve balance, and that doesn't seem likely. So, of course, she doesn't address the fact that all of these things could be operating together, but all of these things operating together still doesn't seem like the right answer. What she did do is she looked at the upper tails of the distributions. She analyzed data from 3 years' worth of the GSS, and she saw that for basically lifetime of partners, number of partners since age 18, the male-to-female ratio and number of partners was around 3 to 1. But when she restricted the distribution to people who report under 20 partners, which is 89% of the sample, then the ratios dropped to very, very much close to balance. So for the number of partners, the male-to-female ratio ranged from about 1.5 to 2. When she restricted the analysis to men and women who reported fewer than 5 partners in the past year, which is 97% of the sample, again, the ratio drops to one of balance. The other thing that she noted was that more than 75% of the upper tail respondents report lifetime partner totals that are in round numbers, 25, 30, 35, 40. What does that mean? People are making their best guesses, or they're doing calculations and then rounding the calculation. She suggested that shorter time frames would reduce the error in numbers in terms of what people are reporting for numbers of partners and frequency of sex. This is a little quick and dirty analysis. I grabbed data that I have access to, so from 3 different data sets. So they're not comparable. They don't ask exactly the same questions, and they obviously are very different populations. But it's illustrative because I could grab 3 different recall windows for similar questions. So the top line is from the Urban Men's Health Study, which was a national probability sample, telephone sample, of MSM living in 4 cities in the United States. This was done in 1997. And what you can see is that we asked the number of male partners they had in the past year. And 14% said none. 83%, which includes the 0, are fewer than 12 partners. I use 12 because the pattern I see is 1 through 10, 12, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. And when you look at values greater than 12, 93% of the responses have a 0 or 5 as the last digit. So 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, etc. Now, when you go to a 3-month window, which is the Elmo study, which was a study where data was collected doing exit surveys from a probability sample of patrons of bathhouses, or a bathhouse actually, combined 2 waves of data. And so we're asking about, we didn't ask straightforwardly for a number of male sex partners in the last 3 months. We did it a little more convoluted way. So I stuck with anal sex partners. We had 26% now who say 0. 91% of the sample gave an answer that's 12 or lower. But of the answers that are above 12, 87% have given what appear to be rounded or estimated responses. In the Keglis-Rebchuk Black MP study, which is still ongoing, which looks at young African-American MSM that's 18 to 29 years old. They're using venue sampling, although the samples are convenience samples for the most part. We asked for a number of male sex partners in the past 2 months. And now we get 59% that say 0. Part of that's because it's African Americans. They're living in Houston and Dallas, and so their access to partners is somewhat limited. 99% of the answers are 12 or lower. And then for values above 12, 69% are still ending in 0 and 5. So the probably error is declining as you go to shorter time frames, but it's declining because the shorter time frame requires less large numbers you're getting more zeros and more smaller numbers. But once they get to larger numbers, they're still guessing, they're still estimating, they're still calculating, even though it's only 2 months. Okay? So, what can we conclude at this point? In my opinion, there's no indication that respondents are not telling the truth, that intentionally misleading people is not the likely scenario given other potential sources of error. There may be some self-presentation bias in the form of giving what are perceived to be socially desirable responses. Numerical responses themselves are probably inaccurate. Okay? And at the upper end of the distribution, they're clearly estimates or calculations. So that when we're asking for numerical responses, the best we can probably assume is that people who give bigger numbers are probably having more sex, and people who give smaller numbers are probably having less sex. So what can we do to reduce self-presentation bias and just in general response error? So these are some of the things that survey researchers do to try and minimize error. So we promise anonymity. We promise to keep the responses confidential. If it's an interview, we try and make sure that it's done in private. No one else is present. The truth is that most of the surveys on sexual behavior are done in a self-administered manner. That is, if they've taken the interviewer even out of the equation. That is to improve privacy, but if it's self-administered, you can't guarantee that the respondent has control of their own privacy. So a trade-off. So another issue is clearly defining the terms you're using in your survey questions. Sex has an almost limitless, infinite number of terms that are used. I'm sure you've all heard that there's been books written, comics have done entire routines about the terminology used either to describe sex or their genitalia or whatever, and the list is endless. And trying to come up with words that will satisfy everybody is difficult, so you tend to pick a standard set of words and define them for people. And by defining them, you're forcing the respondent to kind of play your game. My experience is that people who answer surveys tend to operate on a concrete level. They simply, see the question, hear the question, answer the question. That's what they're trying to do, and they're trying to answer it as honestly as they can. So they're listening or reading very carefully and trying to give you the best possible response. By defining terms, this kind of goes back to, if you're a psychologist, psychophysics, that you are controlling the stimulus that is being given to the respondent. So if you control the stimulus, then you can understand that this answer has some specific meaning. If the meaning of the terms differs a lot across people, then you're going to get a lot of more noise in your responses. The other reason for defining terms is that people become lawyers. It's amazing, especially in the area of their sexual behavior, how many rules people have as to whether something counts or not. So that, and some of the things that seem to influence whether things count or not are how long it lasted, their intent. It only happened that one time. Again, the number of rules are kind of infinite. It's kind of like the drop food rule, if it's only been on the floor 5 seconds, it's still good. So it's not, defining these issues helps you get hopefully more accurate answers. In conjunction with that, with definitions, my new pet peeve is that and I'm involved in surveys where we ask, how many times did you have sex? How many times did you engage in that behavior? Now think about if you had to define what a time was. How would you do that so that everybody would agree with the definition or even understand the definition? In fact, as I thought about it, I tried to figure out how would I get the definition to be less than a page? And I don't want to get too graphic, but you think about kind of the porno film version where they're constantly changing positions, and so he might pull out and they change positions and he goes back in again. They change another position. They do all this stuff. Is each one of those a time, or is that all one time? For some people, we made love all night. And it could be that for one partner, that was one time, and for the other partner, it was many times. And so we don't know. So one of the questions you might ask yourself is, can we keep measuring something that we can't even define for ourselves? And I guess the reasonable answer at this point is, if our only intent is to figure out who's doing more and who's doing less, then we can probably keep asking the question. Because that's all the numbers tell us is that one's higher and that one's lower. But you have to understand that for any given individual, that number is probably not a real number. Okay. Now, when I say define terms, I really mean define terms. So this is a definition that Diane and Bill have been using for anal sex in their survey. So this is actually either read out by the interviewer or now we're doing them Cassie, so they're actually reading this. And they actually go through it in stages to make sure the person understands. And this is a very inclusive definition of anal sex. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to read that. But the important issues is that position doesn't matter, okay? Orgasm doesn't matter. And length of time doesn't matter. As long as there was intromission, we're interested in it. And you should tell us about it. Okay. I also include this definition of what we mean by using or wearing a condom, because this is a matter of some moment, because we're terribly interested in whether people are engaging in unsafe sex. And we know that there can be problems with condom use. And part of the problem is not only do they slip off or break, which is occasionally happens, but also that people are not using them during the entire, they might start without using a condom and hold up, put one on, and then they finish. Other people start using one, and then it kind of gets out of hand, and they end up not using one at the end, etc. And so the emphasis of this definition is about wearing a condom all the time that the insertive partner is inside the receptive partner. I've argued that it should actually say, while wearing an intact condom, but Bill and Diane nixed that. They couldn't, because we would have to define intact, and it would get to, what do you mean by that? And so we haven't come up with wording that will communicate that part of it, but that actually would make for a more precise definition. So another thing that we do to try and reduce error is that we used enhanced introductions to questions. Yes?
So you've just shown us what I would call a very broad definition of anal sex, and then a very narrow definition of the strict definition of using a condom during that time. So you're kind of trying to set that in people's minds.
You're trying to set the
They-
parameters, yes.
They have their own, before they read that, they have their own idea of
Yes.
what counts, as you said, as anal sex or where
Well,
it comes.
it's worse than that. Over the range of 100 people, they have 200 definitions of what you mean by that, yes.
So, to what extent do you think one can succeed in sort of overcoming their default definitions, or are they going to keep using them anyway when they respond?
I think that, this is my opinion. My opinion is that we're probably fairly successful as long as you embed the definitions in each question and you keep repeating it. So in other words, you don't give the definition once, say, oh, the definition of this term is this, and then you keep using the term rather than the definition. The better surveys are using the definition in the question so if they repeat questions, it's getting repeated every time. I think for some people in the method study, our qualitative data showing that for the term insertive was particularly problematic in terms of trying to get them to understand what we meant. Why they could understand receptive but not insertive,
They think of insertive as who's inserting.
right?
You know, like when I say insertive and receptive sex is all inserting. You know, it's like somebody was inserting, so they don't really think of it as a separate, different from receptive. And receptive sex, it was assertive sex too, because somebody was inserting. At least that's kind of the rationale they come up with, and when we ask them later, what happened.
So the other implication in your question is that the definitions you choose, whether you choose to be inclusive or exclusive, has to do with what you're trying to find out.
Yeah.
Okay, and what your intent is. And so that a sexological approach to the research would be different from a public health approach, which might be different from some psychological underpinning of the sexual behavior approach, et cetera. And so whether you use an inclusive or exclusive definition is something the investigator has to decide a priori. Your job as a survey researcher is to make sure that whatever definition you choose to use, that you use it consistently throughout your survey.
I wonder if using a phrase that is slightly off could actually help. So if instead of saying anal sex, you said anal sexual contact, that could, some people have said, well, it doesn't qualify as sex. You would be less likely to do that if that was the phrase you used.
But contact is such a vague term.
Well, then
you define
you
it.
define
yeah.
it here.
Yeah. They've gone back and forth between, it's not a settled matter as to whether using a non-traditional term so that you are pointing at, this is different. So I've given you a definition, this is the different thing you should be thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that if it's so far removed from how people normally think, they just keep sliding back to their own definitions because this is something outside their realm of experience. Because contact tends to mean not. So contact usually is something other than intromission, other than penetration.
Oh, you're thinking of the opposite. So someone
Yeah.
might read contact and say, well, we really had sex, so we didn't have sexual contact.
We didn't have contact.
Yeah.
So it becomes, it's problematic no matter which direction you go in. But the best advice is your question should be explicit and consistent and is descriptive rather than descriptive based rather than terminology based. So you're talking about who's doing what to whom and when and where and how, okay, and not some vague term like insertive or receptive or sexual contact in general. Okay. So justifications. Enhanced introductions. So enhanced introductions do a few things. So one of the things that it can do is justify why we're asking these questions in the first place. Usually a sex survey is kind of embedded in a health survey, or it is branded as, oh, this research is being done on the health of men. And because they don't want to say it's a sex survey when they're recruiting people to do the survey. And so it might become jarring when suddenly they want to ask all these intimate questions, and so they get some justification. This is actually one for income, which, as it turns out, in most national surveys, income is one of the most sensitive questions you can ask. And so in this case, it was couched in terms of people's access to health care. And that's why it's written that way, to get people to say, oh, I'm asking about your income, not because I want to know your income, but because I want to know it for this reason. Okay, and you can do the same things for sexuality. The other thing enhanced introductions can do is communicate to the respondent that there's no right answer or no wrong answer. There's just an answer, okay? And that we've kind of heard it all before. As you can see, this is an example of one. This is talking about disclosure. Some men choose to tell their family and friends that they are sexually attracted to men. Other men choose not to. How many of your family members have you personally told that you're sexually attracted to men? This is a permission-giving kind of introduction. It's okay to say no. It's okay to say yes. It's okay to say a lot. It's okay to say a little. We've heard all the responses. Lots of people do lots of different things. Just tell us what you do. So it's trying to, again, produce more comfort for the respondent to answer the question. Okay, another thing we can do, and what we've just talked about, is ask better questions. So asking questions in a concise and straightforward manner to reduce respondent interpretation. Go ahead.
So is there any evidence to show that those forms of the question actually elicit more accurate responses?
The permission giving?
So the example of that last slide.
Yeah, they do. There's some articles written by Catania.
Yeah, if you look up Catania or Benson,
Yeah,
you gotta find,
you'll find it.
you'll find some stuff.
If you want, I can tell you what it is afterwards. I mean, you can give me your email or something too, or something.
I can tell you it doesn't hurt,
Yeah.
except for the GSS, which I'm
Okay.
going to get to. It might have hurt. So embedding the definitions in the question, as I already talked about, rather than using terminology instead. Ensuring the important elements of the question are highlighted for the respondent. So I give an example here. This is actually pulled from our evaluation of the empowerment study with young MSM. So you can see that we're not talking about insertive anal sex or receptive anal sex or whatever. We're talking about, you putting your penis in another man's rectum, okay, past 60 days, not using a condom. These are the things that we're trying to make explicit. And even though so this might start with, in the past 60 days, how many times did you have sex with a man? How many times did you put your penis in? How many times did you put your penis in with using a condom, without using a condom? But you're always saying the same words. Okay, so you're kind of pounding them with this. This is the information I want in this particular circumstance. Okay. Okay. Now, I want to go on a little bit of a tangent here because this has been kind of one of the things that we've been interested in, we being Bill and Diane and I, is this hunt for the risky MSM and trying to get them to participate in our studies. So we often use surveys of sexual behavior are used to monitor and understand the sexual repertoires of the population of interest. We also might use them to identify sexually risky subpopulations and evaluate the impact of risk reduction interventions. So the problem is, if you don't get risky guys, how do you see reductions in risk? Okay? So we were doing a method study to compare, we did a method study to compare standardized interviewing to conversational interviewing. Don't worry about what those things are, but just be aware that for this study we wanted highly sexually active men because we didn't want people reporting a bunch of zeros and ones. We wanted guys with lots of partners and lots of sexual contacts, and when we asked them about numbers, they would give us high numbers. And so we have variance. So we primarily recruited at bathhouses and sex clubs. They had to have reported anal sex with a man in the prior 3 months in order to qualify for the study. We also screened them for sex venue use because we found that multi-venue use is an indicator of high levels of sexual activity and high levels of risky sexual activity. And so men who had been to a sex club or bathhouse in the last 3 months and had also used the internet to hook up with another man for sex or had sex in a cruising area were deemed to be high-risk men, and 63% of the sample met that criteria. We didn't screen out low-risk men. We wanted to be able to balance the two arms of the intervention studies, so we wanted to make sure that this wasn't skewed in one arm or the other. And when we first looked at the numbers, we got a lot of risky guys. The mean age was 44. 36% were HIV positive. 22% have been diagnosed with an STI in the past year. For people who normally look at these in general populations, these figures are high. 82 reported having insertive sex in the last 3 months with a mean near 6 partners. 55% had unprotected insertive, meaning of 3 partners. 77% had receptive sex, 4.5 partners, and 48% had unprotected receptive with a mean of 2 partners. And then when we started looking at the medians, and our hearts began to sink because what do we see? The medians are much lower. And so when you categorize people into the highest degree of risk behavior that they engage in, then it really begins to get difficult. So no anal sex, obvious. Safe anal, basically they use condoms 100% of the time. Unsafe strategic, for the last 3 months that means strategic positioning, that positive men did not engage in insertive sex and negative men did not engage in receptive sex. If they did engage in non-strategic, unsafe sex, that they use withdrawal, and then the bottom line is obviously the riskiest behavior. So now what we're seeing, so I could look at this for the last 3 months. I could also look at it we asked about the last male partner that they had sex with. For the last partner, their strategic includes that they serosorted, they either serosorted or seropositioned. Okay. So what we see is that 2/3 of the men had unsafe anal sex in the last 3 months. 1/3 had unsafe anal sex with their last partner. But 2/3 of the men who engaged in unprotected anal intercourse in the last 3 months, and 86% of those who had unprotected anal intercourse with their last partner were already using some kind of harm or risk reduction strategy. They're not necessarily efficient strategies. After all, if you're serial sorting, you're trusting that what they told you is true. Okay. But and withdrawal is obviously depends on your control, and if you're the receptive partner, you're depending on his control, etc. But nevertheless, these are strategies that people are using, and so suddenly we're down to, on the last partner, there really isn't anybody who's not using some kind of strategy to reduce their risk. In the last 3 months, it's still 25%, but you think, boy, I got 500 people, and suddenly, in terms of the risky people, not so many. Okay? And so when you're evaluating your interventions and saying, did I reduce risk? Okay, usually you're just looking at UAI, and in a lot of studies, what do you see? Nothing. And the answer is, one of the answers is that men are not starting at square zero. They are not simply having unprotected sex. They are already engaging in risk strategies. And so one of the things I would say is that you need to kind of chart this out at baseline and then chart it out again post-intervention and see if people have at least moved down or moved up, actually, in this case, moved up from unsafe sex to safe sex, but they may not be moving from just unprotected UAI with no risk reduction to, oh, I used condoms and did all these wonderful things that you asked me to do. It may be something in between. And detecting that is difficult. Analyzing it is more difficult. I'm not going to sit here and say we've worked out the strategies to do that, but I foresee many conferences with Tor in the future. So let's go back to the GSS. This is the introduction to the sexual behavior assessment in the General Social Survey. This has not changed since 1989. They ask the same questions every year. So they couch the introduction, they justify it, but they couch it in terms of AIDS. I have no idea what the influence of that is, but I'm assuming that for some people that influenced their responses.
It's an excuse to ask sex questions. They didn't ask before 89.
Right, they didn't ask before 89.
I mean, the government doesn't ask, hardly ever ask.
And then this is the first question they ask. How many sex partners have you had in the last 12 months? So the first thing you notice is, what's the definition of sex? No idea. It's left to the respondent. The second thing you might notice is, that's funny, I've been reading these papers where they're telling me how many partners people had in the last 12 months, and the response is categorical. So what they've been doing is they've been taking the midpoints and assigning that. So they're complaining that the numbers don't add up, but they're taking, in fact, estimates of estimates. So, please. Then they ask whether those partners in the last 12 months were male, female, or both male and female. And then this is how they ask the frequency question, which is, mind you, also categorical. So again, they've assigned midpoints. Also notice that they're really not asking how many times you had sex. It's really more along the lines of how many days. It's kind of like the drug questions. The drug questions now, right, they're going and asking, in the past 30 days, how many times did you use this substance? So there's some noise in there because, if you use the substance from 11 at night to 2 in the morning, is that 1 day or 2 days? Oh, there's a little noise in there. Okay. So they kind of finesse it and kind of ask you in terms of how many days of the week or how many days of the month are you having sex. But it's still the numbers that they write these articles and do these criticisms based on these precise numbers that actually don't exist in real time.
So the midpoint of 4 or more times a week is infinity?
Well, they picked a number, and different authors have used different maximum numbers, although they've said in the past that whatever number they pick doesn't usually change things very much because it's out of the tail. They do ask, interestingly, the number of partners since age 18. That they ask is a numeric response. This, by the way, is how they identified heterosexual respondents. The people who only had male partners, or only men who only had female partners, and women who only had male partners since age 18. That's who they analyzed for this stuff about what happened in the last 12 months. Even though there's actually no consistency pattern, that's okay. They didn't require that to jive. So that's another source of error. And this is the condom question. Last time you had sex, was a condom used? Suddenly they define sex kinda. By sex we mean vaginal, oral, or anal sex. So if the last time, think about how much oral sex occurs between lesbians and between gay men, and then they ask if a condom is used. Well, condoms aren't used very much in oral sex, and so you're wondering what kind of estimates they're getting. That's part of it. The other thing is that if you remember the op-ed piece, that he's talking about, well, they had this many times that they engaged in sexual intercourse, and this percentage of the time they used the condom, and so you come up with this, and it doesn't match the condom sales numbers. You're going, yeah, but you didn't ask about all the times I had intercourse. You only asked about the last time. So again, the numbers are kind of off. Okay. The GSS, it's confidential, it's anonymous, it's confidential. The answers are kept confidential. They're using Cassie, so they've taken the interviewer out of it. Okay. It is an interview study. A lot of these things are interviews, but the sex part of it, the sensitive part of it is done in Cassie. That's computer-assisted self-interview for people who don't know all the jargon. And they justify why they're asking the sex questions. The justification, unfortunately, may have created some bias. Okay, they don't define sex. The 12-month numbers are pre-categorized estimates that don't differentiate male and female partners if you're bisexual. And the condom question only asks about the last time and includes oral sex. So, not a good start. Okay, this raises issues about how do respondents answer questions they're trying to answer honestly. So this is not unique, again, to GSS. It's not unique to sex surveys even. So naive respondents did not know that they were supposed to be counting their sexual exploits. This is one of the reasons why they're estimating or why they're guessing. They didn't know they were supposed to count. But if you ask somebody, well, how many pairs of shoes did you buy in the last 12 months? Did you count them? Well, you might have a good visualization of your closet and give that number, which might not be the number that you bought, okay, in the last year. But anyway, people are making estimations because they didn't know they're supposed to count it. It wasn't, and for people who are having a lot of sex, counting might be extremely difficult, not to mention all the issues if you're asking them times rather than people what's the time. The definition terminology for sex is highly variable across respondents, so if you don't define it, you're going to get lots of different answers. It's also not always easy to map one's responses onto the response set. So when you ask a question like, well, how frequently did you have sex in the last year? And they go, hardly ever, never, hardly, once or twice, less than once a week, about once a week, 2 to 3 times a week, once a month, 2 to 3 times a month, et cetera, et cetera. They give these things. And the person, my partner, I only have sex with my main partner, but she was she got assigned to another, her work assigned her to Paris for 3 months. Okay, so she's only home for 9 months. So it's 3 months out of the year where we didn't have sex. How do I answer the question? So you're going to have to go through a more some people will simply say, I don't know, and just not try and answer. Others will answer as though they had sex the entire year, which is not accurate. Others will try and calculate based on kind of prorating out or, saying, okay, I take this, so say she was gone for 6 months, so I can take half of it and do that, and so it should be this, but it becomes very complicated. People's sex lives are messy. They're complicated. Partners are available and not available. I'm active, I'm not active. I was busy, I wasn't busy. I had money, I didn't have money. Stuff happens. So answering these kinds of questions can be difficult for respondents to give you the kind of response you're looking for. Okay. So if the GSS is so bad, and it's bad, are there other places we might go to look for information on sexual behavior? Because one of the things that the author of the op-ed piece said was, we don't know much about sex, and he's right. We don't know much about it because they don't want to ask, the government doesn't want us to ask many questions about it. They're not funding surveys to look in detail at sexual behavior, for the most part. So one might look at the National Health Interview Survey, which is an annual survey of a national probability sample of households, around 35,000 households. It's actually conducted by the Census Bureau. They do not ask about sex in this. The NHIS is looking at what kind of health problems do you have and what kind of access do you have to health care. They do have a self-defined orientation question, however, and they do ask a little bit about, well, they ask if you've ever been tested for HIV, and if you haven't, why haven't you been tested? What are the reasons why you haven't been tested? So that might be useful in getting descriptive data for sexual minorities, at least. Okay. There's the California Health Interview Survey. This is run by the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research. Westat is the data collection subcontractor. It's a biannual survey of a statewide probability sample of around 50,000 people. They actually sample households, and they'll grab an adult. If there's a qualifying teenager, they'll interview them. If there's a qualified child, they'll also interview them. The other big selling point of the GIS is that it's done in English, Spanish, Cantonese, Mandarin, Korean, Tagalog, and Vietnamese. So they're not, most things are typically done in English only or English and Spanish, and they're missing a lot of the Asian population, Asian American population, and the state of California wanted to make sure they didn't miss that. So they do a better job of that. However, there's no introduction to the sexual behavior questions. The questions are not asked if you're over 70 years of age. There's no definition of sex. They ask about the number of partners you had in the past 12 months. It's asking for a numeric response. The gender of those partners. That's the entire sexual behavior section. That's it. That's everything they ask. There is a self-defined orientation question, some stuff about HIV testing, but otherwise doesn't tell you much. Okay, so the best sources are actually surveys that are being run by the National Center for Health Statistics, the NCHS. So one of them is the NHANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. It runs in 2-year cycles, interviewing a national probability sample. There are no age limits. I didn't go through all the methodology to figure out how they're getting data from 1-year-olds, but I assume their parents are answering for them. But they're doing that. So annually it's about 5,000, so a cycle will have about 10,000 people in the sample. There's no introduction to the sex questions. The questions are not asked if you're 70 or older. The initial question to men is, have you ever had any kind of sex with a woman? And they define sex as vaginal, oral, or anal sex. But those terms are not defined for the respondent at the time they ask the question. Okay, then there is a succeeding set of ever had questions where they ask about different kinds of sex. And so they ask about vaginal sex, and they define it. Reasonable. They ask about performing oral sex on a woman. Reasonable. I did this from the male perspective because most of our research has been about men having sex with men. This is about men. I mean, you assume that there are parallel questions for the women. Okay. I apologize for my male-centric focus. Where am I? Okay. And they ask about anal sex with the woman, but the definition all of a sudden gets squeamish. They don't say inside, they say contact. What does that mean? Okay, as we've already discussed, contact can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Okay, they ask if they have had any kind of sex with a man, including oral or anal, but they don't define those at this point. So they don't repeat the definitions that they were using. So they define it when they are having sex with a woman, but not when they have sex with a man. Again, it looks like they got squeamish. Then they ask for the number of women they had sex with, had vaginal sex with, performed oral sex on. In the lifetime of past 12 months, note that they do not ask for the number of anal sex partners. Interesting. Squeamish. Then they asked for the number of men they had anal sex with, that they had anal sex with, or either anal or oral sex with. And then they specifically asked about the number of men they had anal sex with, lifetime and past 12 months. These are all numeric responses. And then at this point they stop and ask, have you ever performed oral sex on a man? And now they define it. So now they suddenly define it. Okay, and then they ask for the number of men that you engaged in that act with. There are no questions about receiving oral sex from either men or women. Then in the past 12, then they ask, in the past 12 months, the number of times I've had vaginal or anal sex. It's a categorical response. And it's not asked separately for male or female partners. So you're going to have to, in order to get reasonable data, you're going to have to select for behavioral heterosexuals, probably using the lifetime data. Okay. And then they ask how frequently you use condoms. So there is a general condom use question. It's asked categorically. They also ask about STIs and about self-defined orientation. So the National Survey for Family Growth is probably your best bet here. This is also run by the NHIS. It runs in cycles that have ranged from 1 to 5 years. They're currently in a 5-year cycle. It's a national probability sample of men and women, ages 15 to 44. Again, it's about 5,000 annually, so it's a more limited age range. Okay. They ask separate sections on sexual behavior for women having sex with men having sex with women, and men having sex with men. There's still no introduction, so there's no justification. They use an initial set of ever questions to define whether you're performing and receiving oral sex, whether you're engaging in insertive or receptive anal sex. So that is good. Okay. Each ever question is followed by whether they used a condom the last time they engaged in that behavior. They do ask for number of partners, lifetime in the last 12 months. But the condom use question still, the general condom use question includes oral sex, which is still a little odd to me. They also ask a lot of, mixed into this, I didn't give you the whole thing, but mixed into this, there are questions about the characteristics of the last partner, their demographic characteristics, and some of their, whether they're risky partners or not. Whether they intentionally serial sort, it's kind of a yes-no question. And they have questions about their feelings of sexual attraction to men and women and their self-defined orientation. So I would say in general, the GSS, the NHIS, the CHIS, don't use these. They're not good sources of information. The NHANES is good for sex with opposite gender partners, but I think the best bet for sex between same gender partners is to look at the National Survey for Family Growth, except that the condom use question isn't very good. Okay. So, in general, the things we should consider when either looking for data sets or evaluating data that's reported to us in journal articles, or alternatively, when you're designing your own survey, these are all the things that you need to consider when you're designing, if you were designing an instrument. So, or evaluating what's going on. So, can you identify the target population? Does the sampling approach yield a representative sample of sufficient size from the target population? So there's actually 3 things in there. Is it representative? Is it a sufficient size? And is it from the target population? Because some of these internet recruitment things, not only can't you define the target population, but you have no idea who they got. You begin to wonder after a while. What are the data goals? So getting a prevalence estimate for a behavior, for example, is different from wanting some kind of numeric point estimate, which is different from perhaps wanting enough data to make a policy recommendation. I make that differentiation because Health budgets these days are in the millions and billions of dollars. And so being off by a little bit, 0.1%, means that tens of millions of dollars may be misallocated. And so usually those kinds of studies are now done as multi-center studies with thousands and thousands of respondents. It's just something to keep in mind is what your intent is to whether you're going to get sufficient data. Is the data collection method likely to preserve anonymity and confidentiality and provided privacy? If they were IRB reviewed, that's probably practically guaranteed, but there's a lot of stuff out there. So I'm just reminding you to pay attention. Is the presence or absence of an interview appropriate to the questions being asked? I mention that because in general, the trend has been to take the interviewer out of the equation, to eliminate interviewer bias, and to give more privacy to the individual so that they would be more comfortable to disclose these sensitive behaviors that they're engaged in. However, if you're doing, say, a partner-by-partner sexual behavior assessment, we've found that it's very difficult using CASI to keep people on track as to which partner they're talking about. And we see that because the amount of inconsistent responses starts to grow as you move through the partners. Whereas the presence of an interviewer is paying attention about, so we're still talking about, Jeff, right, or Mary or whoever, that we're still talking about this partner, right? You can keep them on track and remind them about who we're talking about. Does the survey instrument answer the research questions and meet the data goals? Are the sexual terms defined for respondents in a credible way? Are the definitions inclusive or exclusive, and are those definitions appropriate given the research questions? Is the recall window used for the survey reasonable and appropriate to the research questions and data goals? There's a trade-off between coverage and accuracy. In other words, shorter period of time might be less representative of their behavior, okay, but you assume that you are getting more accurate responses with a shorter recall window. So there's that trade-off. Does each question clearly specify the who, what, when, and how of the sexual behavior that you're asking about? So going back to that highly detailed question, the exemplar question that I showed you, are they asking questions in a way that will actually get them real answers? Do the data look, when you're evaluating journal articles, do the data look generally reasonable? What's the range of responses? How much variance do they have? How much missing data do they have? If they ask, we ask, well, how many partners did you have in the last 3 months? And they answer 1,000. Well, they could be a sex worker, but it raises questions. Do the interpretations of the data match with the questions asked in the survey instrument? Well, this is actually true of any journal article that you read, but you need to make sure that the stuff they're talking about in the discussion relate to what they were talking about in the methods and the results. Because I've seen papers where the discussion seems to be from a different study. Do the interpretations of the data match with the sample surveyed? If you do a venue sample, your population is the patron population of that venue or venues, not the population of people in that city or that state or any other place. Do the interpretations of the data match with the data presented in text and tables? Again, I've seen where the table says one thing and the discussion says maybe not the opposite, but it has been focused in a different way. So those are all considerations. I would say that those are things, like I said, that you need to consider when you're evaluating papers, evaluating the sources of data, particularly in the realm of sexual behavior. You're going to see a lot of data that comes from a lot of different places. And so I want you to be critical about the data, because sometimes in the absence of data, you usually glom onto, well, having any data is better than none. But having truly bad data is worse than having no data, because you draw the wrong conclusions. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is kind of the back half of the op-ed piece, which is he looked at Google search data. And so this comes up with the issue of he's kind of using a form of big data. And big data is kind of a hot topic now. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this. A lot of this information is contained in a panel report just done by APOR. And I've given a reference up top there. It is accessible on their main website. Big data is characterized by the fact that there's a lot of it, which is why they call it big data. It's usually reported, it usually comes in very high frequency because it's usually not being collected by interviewers. It's usually something that's being done automatically. But it comes in no standard format. So looking across different sources, you might have to do a lot of massaging in order to make it all work together. I give examples here of where the various sources of data might be. It's the bottom bullet that's of particular interest is, I called it a fungible quality. As they point out in the report, even within something like a Google search, how that search is being done and how that they get results back to the individual will change. In fact, the reason they're collecting data on searches is not so they can let us do some stuff about what people think about sex. They're trying to refine their search algorithms, right? That's the purpose of the data. So that algorithm might change without notice. So if you're taking data, I took data from the last 5 years. Well, that algorithm that's underlying the data you're looking at might have changed dozens or even hundreds of times, and you have no idea how. And so the data might not be comparable. The data are being analyzed in a way that is secondary to the original intent for collecting it, sometimes called found data rather than made data, or, and you notice this in the report, is that the new term is data exhaust, which really kind of brings to the fore what some people think about what these data are.
And what does it exactly mean? Because exhaust is also what the car has in the back.
Yes,
That's what they mean.
What they mean is what's being expelled,
Okay.
what's being thrown away.
But
Yes.
but it also can mean tired.
Yes. Well, you can easily get overwhelmed by it. So there are also some ethical issues. Obviously, who owns that data is still being bandied around in many forms. There's lots of data issues. The people collecting the data may have labeled variables as being something, and when you get into the guts of it, you find out that that's not what you think that is. The amount of missing data may actually be considerable. So you're being overwhelmed with these huge amounts of data. But embedded in that is that you find out that lots of people don't answer those questions or didn't do those things, and so you have a lot of missing data. And how to handle that might be something that has to be addressed. There's also big sampling issues. You're not sure who's been included. Not only can you necessarily identify the population, but some people who should have been in there aren't. People who shouldn't have been are. Duplications are an issue. And if that's not reported, you should be skeptical about the data because they need to tell you how they're handling the data. And very often they say, I looked at this big data, this is what I saw, which is how the op-ed piece works. Now, that's not a scientific journal article, so you have to give allowances. But there's not much telling you what's going on. So in survey research, a high response rate does not always equate with high-quality data. And a low response rate does not always equate with low-quality data. In other words, the response rate does not tell you anything about bias. So similarly, having a lot of data does not mean you have a lot of useful information. You may have scads and scads and scads and scads of actually useless information. You need to be skeptical. In the example that is illustrated in the op-ed piece, first and foremost, when you're doing a search, looking at Google searches, it really starts as a qualitative thematic study. So there's no description of how he arrived at the themes he was interested in. And so from a qualitative standpoint, it's already a complete fail. So he uses that as the basis for gathering this quantitative data, but the front end of it is not there. So can we identify the target population? Well, presumably it's Google English readers, not speakers, readers, different population. I assume worldwide, wherever English-speaking Google is used. English reading, excuse me. So we also don't know the length of time across which the data were aggregated. Okay. We have no idea. We don't have information about Google users, so whatever sample we got, we have no idea whether it's representative. We have no indication of whether multiple searches were adjusted for, although the author does cite a source suggesting that he may have, misspelled people, oversampled for people with who are interested in sexual topics. My own feeling is that probably in the pantheon of searches done on Google, that searches on sexually related topics is probably really not that big. So it really doesn't tell us that much about his qualitative data. The data he brought from the searches really doesn't tell us that much about the frequency of sexual behavior or the number of partners. I'm worried that he thinks it does. The bottom line of the APOR report is that big data is meant to be a complement to survey data, not something you use instead of. And you can see all the problems with the data, the skepticism you need to bring with it, that I think that's an appropriate response to it. And if you hear anybody talking about, oh, the future is big data, and we'll just have all these scads of data, and that's what we'll do, and you can get rid of all this other stuff, I don't think that's really where we're going. Okay. I pontificated for an hour and a half. I apologize for being so long. Any questions? Questions, comments? Yes.
I have a question. Going back to the ideas around providing longer introductions before you get into sensitive data and then repeating the definitions you're talking about through each session. We're often working with Kathy, so computer assisted.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have an interviewer speaking the questions to the respondent, and then them telling you, and then the
Recording on like a laptop or
right,
whatever,
and then, putting that
in real time.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
in real time. Because we work in kind of these rural, rural areas of low literacy and kind of low access to computers. So I'm wondering, how do you balance making sure people understand the definitions and having sufficient introductions with time, and also like not having your interviewers or respondents want to like jump out a window
Right.
after they've heard the same
Right.
definition 8 times?
Right. So, again, well, okay. Anybody who knows me, you've heard this before. Behavioral research is all rocks and hard places, right? You're making the best of, bad choices, or really what you're doing is you're balancing what do you need and what can you get. Okay, so part of your decision is about, with any survey, you start with, what do I have to have? What do I want to have? And what would I really like to have, kind of luxury items? Okay, and what gets included in the survey, okay, is balanced against how long it is, how taxing it is on the individual. And so you start, whittling away at the luxury items, and then you're getting into the want-to-haves, preserving the gotta-haves. Okay? So how much detail you put in introductions, definitions, questions depends on how accurate that those data must be for you to either make a policy recommendation or to evaluate that intervention or whatever it is. How the quality of the data, you're going to have to determine how good that needs to be. I would say that not all these introductions and definitions have to be as long as what I put there. Obviously, you want them to be somewhat shorter, but the issue of especially since an interviewer is present, you want to be able to, part of that developing your kind of connection with the person, because that's one of the reasons why you're using interviewers, not only to get the information, but to create a rapport and get them comfortable to answer questions. So using words that makes them more comfortable will help you. Anything that confuses them will not help you. So if you use jargony terminology and they're going, huh? You're going to need to use, the general rule for survey researchers is you use the common vernacular of your respondents. So if you're asking about sex, and it's in a particular subpopulation, you want to use the sexual vernacular of that subpopulation. Use the words they use. Right? That may take some interviewing and focus groups and stuff before you ever design your interview to get the right words. But I would say more than the great bugaboo is consistency. When you use a word, keep using it. I don't care what words you use, actually. Well, I do. But whatever words you decide to use, you need to use them consistently. So don't say sex, then sexual intercourse, then vaginal intercourse. If you mean the same thing by all of those, you need to pick one and use one. It'll be boring, okay, but accurate. If you change the terms, you have to remember that people are very concrete. If they hear a different word, you're cueing them that you want a different response. So synonyms do not work.
I'm wondering if you have used kind of other prompts or tools to help you in that process. So, for example, so you're asking people questions, but then you have something that they can look at that has the definition. So the next 25 questions are going to be about sex. This is the definition of sex that I'm just leaving in front of you.
Yes, we've done that. Also, when they do things online, they've done things where they set up a thing where the definitions are always available, or the term is highlighted, so if you put your cursor on it, the definition will pop up. And so far, what the studies show is that people don't use them. They read the definition once, they internalize it, their interpretation, and then that's what they stick with. Okay, and they don't go back and say, it's the rare person who goes back and goes, oh wait, that's the definition, I got this wrong, let me go back. Doesn't happen. My experience with respondents is that they're like very poor computers. When they turn the page, their memory gets wiped. Okay, so which is how you get inconsistent responses. I asked you how many partners did you have, sex partners did you have in the last 6 months, and you gave me this number, and then I asked how many partners did you have vaginal sex with, and you gave me a higher number. It's because they turned the page and the line went blank, and then they gave another answer. And so in online studies, literally they only see one question per screen. So they're wiping pretty fast, which can create its own.
But you have checks for something like this,
Yes.
right?
Yes. So now you're spending a lot of programming time with logic checks. This number can't be bigger than that. Oops, you made a mistake. Go back and one of these needs to be corrected. Please go back and correct that. Something like that. I've even seen sex behavior assessments where they've gone in and asked all these questions. It's a long convoluted thing, and then at the end they ask, so we've asked you all these questions and may have reminded you about stuff. Do you want to adjust the number of partners you have? And let them go back and do that. So, which clearly shows that particular question is something they're terribly interested in. So there's lots of tricks of I don't want to call them tricks of the trade. They're really practical. If you sat down and really had to think about these things long and hard for many hours, that these are the things you would come up with on your own. Diane and I are in the methods course. We're available to consult and help with things like, reviewing surveys and helping you come up with how to best ask these questions.
Like cognitive interviewing at some point.
Well,
And
it
I
can
think,
be.
yeah, if you're designing questions, then when you pre-test them, you can do lots of different kinds of pre-tests. And one in particular, cognitive interviewing, helps you get a sense of how they're seeing the question. And then you can use opportunities to change it, where you actually collect your data.
Thank you for attending my non-statistical presentation.